Hey, welcome everybody from Traders Point. So excited you guys are with us today. I have a chance to have a really interesting conversation today with a couple of our vetted counselors from Traders Point. So if you were to go to Traders Point's website, tpcc.org, and specifically to the counseling page, so tpcc.org/counseling, we have a list of vetted counselors who we really trust, where you can get some great help from counselors that are trained and certified to give you some great help beyond what we might be able to offer in groups or some of our church resources. And so Stephanie and Paul Ober are with us today from Refining Grace Counseling, and they're part of our vetted counselors. And so I wanted you guys to be able to hear from them, to get to know them a little bit, but also for them to be able to share some of their insights and their unique perspectives on some of the topics that we're addressing in this Let's Talk About It series. And so, first off, just want to give them a chance to introduce themselves and for you guys to get to know them a little bit. So let's start with Stephanie. Stephanie, tell us a little bit about you and about your practice.
Hey, Stephanie Castle with Refining Grace Counseling. I got my degree at Indiana Wesleyan University in marriage and family therapy back in '06. I've worked at East 91st Street Christian Church and the Christian Theological Seminary downtown. And predominantly, I work with either individuals, usually age 14 and up, or I work with couples. I do a lot of couples work as well and families, and just love the work, love the opportunity to work with people, and especially just to get to be a part of the body of Christ and work from a Christian integrative point of view.
That's awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that. Paul, would love for you to be able to introduce yourself as well and tell us a little bit about you and how your practice looks.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Paul Ober. I've been working with Refining Grace. Stephanie and I have been working together for the last 14 years in private practice. Before that, I was a school social worker down in Evansville. And I like to go back, Nick, that I actually grew up at Traders Point, didn't grow up going to church, but started going to Traders Point back in youth group years. And I make the joke, I went to church more about the cute girls youth group than about God, but God captured my heart when I was 17. I was baptized. And then one of those cute girls, a youth group, became my wife. So high school sweethearts. We were baptized and married at the old Church Point building on Lafayette Road, and moved down to Evansville for many years, and then came back. So I was really excited to come back and do counseling here. Practice-wise, through my school experience, I've done a lot with youth, and then also with individuals and marriage would be my focus.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that background too. It's always good to hear from people that grew up in the church, and it's fun to hear from people that are also. I married my high school sweetheart as well, so it's always fun to meet people who are in the same boat.
Love it.
Well, thanks guys for sharing just kind of like what your practice looks like and a little bit about you. Would love to jump into just the topic from as we're recording it this past Sunday. So Aaron talked about anger. Would love for you guys to be able to share from your unique perspective. What would you want people to know from a counseling perspective about anger?
I would say anger is often a secondary emotion in that it comes up to kind of cover or protect us from hurt and fear. And so it has a purpose. Sometimes it can be an arrow pointing to some things that we need to work on and
Mm,
accept and just continue to mine for more information about ourselves and our motives. And so I think it's really important that we take anger not just as something that's negative, but also look at it as, is it a roadmap that's pointing us towards something we need to work on?
Well,
mm,
it's definitely, I heard a really great working definition. I like the idea of seeing anger as a way to preserve our worth, our needs, or our convictions. And sometimes, as you're saying, Stephanie, like I feel like we don't know how to verbalize that. So sometimes out of lack of how else to say it, we might express it or spew it or stuff it. And so that idea of what other ways can we do? So emotional regulation or really understanding where is this hurt coming from? But also to be fair, being sensitive to if this is trauma based, that's another level that needs to be addressed differently.
mm.
Exactly.
Tell me a little bit more about that. Like when you say trauma based, what do you mean there, Paul?
Well, to be angry, again, if it's talking about a basic need and worth and conviction, you should be angry about some things that happen. So maybe to that point, that response is appropriate. But if it's getting out of balance or getting you in trouble with other relationships. The other thing I find very interesting is, when do people come to counseling or realize they have an anger problem? It's usually in the context of a relationship, right? And so how is it interfering as a father with their kids, or a mother dealing with kids, or in a situation, boyfriend, girlfriend, or spouse situation? So putting in the context, what are you trying to gain from having a better way? Or to the trauma language, is it past experiences impacting current situations? And so helping someone dive into, where's this really coming from? Steph, you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think you're right on. I think, a lot of times anger is an appropriate response, but it's how we manage it, what we do with it, that helps. And I know sometimes anxiety can come across more aggressive. And, if we deal with that aggression in a healthy way, maybe that's taking a boxing class, or running, or pounding a basketball, or just, venting with a therapist, can be really helpful to continue to work on that and see what's really underneath that.
Yeah, it's so good. I think of a lot of the conversations I've had just with people in this season, feeling confused about their anger, and like just noticing, man, I'm angry, and sometimes I've even heard people say they need help pinpointing that they are angry, like I don't even realize I'm angry and I need help kind of like filtering that out. But I think it's also easy in this season, where we've been in the midst of a global pandemic for quite some time, that there's kind of this like residual stacking up of factors where that kind of bubbles up to the surface before you even realize it.
Nick, I mean, to your point, sorry, can I add, like a tip or something to do with it? I think particularly from a youth standpoint, think about youth getting angry. The idea of, well, stop it, that's never good enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't just stop it. So I think it's much healthier and productive to give them something to do with it, right? Mm-hmm. And so using it from a kid model, but I think it can also apply to us adults. But from a kid, one of the things literally I like to say to youth is, show me self-control. Right? To crunch your anger. Like, if you can see, like if I literally put my hands in handcuffs, right? If I'm getting angry, I'm being mean to my siblings or talking back, if I put myself in self-control, crunch my anger, I have something to do. And literally, if you crunch it and then you release it, it kind of feels good. It feels like you did something, versus just stop it and get over it, right? Stephanie, you mentioned as adults, maybe we need to, go exercise, or go for a run or bike ride, or, lift weights, something to get it out. Notice all of these, I think, Nick, are important because they're productive, healthy, not, the old joke of counseling could be, go in this room, we're going to give you both two foam swords to hit each other with, and that'll help work out your aggression. I think the idea of screaming in a pillow or punching a wall, I think those are aggressive, destructive things that could lead to further problems. So I challenge, do something that's more productive and not harmful or destructive. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. And I would add that with kids, I often tell parents, like, have more on the yes list than the no list. Like, we have some no's about what we don't do when we're angry, but as many things as they can do that's appropriate and that helps them express in good ways. It's always better to have a longer list of yeses if you can, so they have more to choose from for how to deal.
Well, and this might add to other topics we're going to talk about, but the idea of emotional regulation and connecting yourself in the moment, because you're right, things stack on top of each other, so it can have a sense of lack of control. So some things you can always control is your breathing, or maybe your hands, or putting your hands in your pockets, or tactile sensory stuff. There's things you can do to feel like you have some sense of control if things are feeling out of control.
So good. There's so much rich things there, because I'm thinking, like, as a parent, I have 3 boys at home, 7, 5, and 4. And there's times even they're feeling the pandemic right now, just even last night, I can't remember exactly what it was. Oh, it's something that they normally do at school, like an annual tradition. It was Valentine's. They were going to give out Valentine's to their friends. Well, we're not doing that this year because COVID. And just those things even affect them. And for them, at times, it comes out as anger. And as much as it's easier as parents or adults to picture a kid throwing a tantrum, but we do the same thing, right? But I love, Stephanie, your point of give them yeses. This is, yes, what you do with that anger, which takes a lot more intentionality. And honestly, just as parents, a lot of times we're not equipped to think that way, because that's not how we were parented. Those are not resources we have. So that's really good. Are there any, you may have already used them all, but like, are there other like yeses that you would give for kids or adults?
Give families that's harder to do this time of year because it's so cold, but is get water balloons. Fill up a bucket full of water balloons and let your kids slam them against a tree or a brick wall or something like that. That's great for small kids, to that release of emotion, and make it fun. Like, releasing aggression doesn't always have to be while we're aggressive. If you've stuffed it already in the day, making time to get it out later can still be a valid, helpful thing. We can't always stop our work day or our school day to get it out right then, but are we getting it out at some point? It's really important.
So good. Yeah. And I was going to add, if I can, the idea of, you're right too. If we think about our parenting, or like, okay, let's help them have a transition time to know what's coming. We might even say, hey, you guys seem a little bit squirrely. Can you give me 5 push-ups or 5 jumping jacks, or let's run around the room before I ask you to do the next task. And we see that as helping them transition, but we don't do that for ourselves, right? So now, great, as adults, before I go to the next meeting, I might do 5 push-ups. Maybe I should, but like, you know what I mean? Like, we took some time to actually be in tune with ourselves, we might be not as stuffed up.
Right. And another thing I would add is the idea of mindfulness. We think of this more under the guise of dealing with anxiety, but anger too. My daughter's on the autism spectrum, and we talk a lot about managing meltdowns when she was little. She's great now, but I actually took a Tai Chi class with her for a while. I took the class for years, but then I brought her in a little bit, just learning some of that mindfulness and mindfulness movement and other things that help with breathing and focus and staying present. There are a lot of different meditative practices. Then, finding what you find is appropriate and useful for your family is important. And I think that's the other side of it, is, okay, how do I regulate heart rate and all those things?
So good. So good. Well, I better keep us moving or we're going to run out of time. This is great. This is awesome. I think this will help people a lot. And I think these are conversations people just aren't having. And so it's really going to be awesome to be able to share this with people and just give these ideas and resources, and even just to get people thinking down this road. So tell me a little bit about, if we transition on to the next topic, we're going to be talking about addiction. And so I know this is a huge, huge thing and so prominent in my own family and so many families around us. What are just some basic thoughts, tips, ideas about the idea of addiction, whether it's our own or people in our family?
In the topic of addiction, I would say in my practice that if it's heavy substance abuse, such as alcohol or stronger substance, that they would need greater assistance. Is that where they might need, like, for example, Fairbanks or inpatient treatment? But, I also don't want to say I don't deal with addiction, because the idea of some alcohol, some marijuana, some definite pornography, can I even say maybe eating or goal setting? I think there's different ways to think about what our addictions can be. Definitely talk about those. So sometimes I would say the bent of my practice would be more on addiction to pornography. And if I can go into that topic, I think of addiction in some terminologies of, like, you heard the idea of HALT. If you're hurting, angry, lonely, or tired, that's when you're more likely to be susceptible to giving into that addiction. And a lot of times that addiction is an escape to there's something about life that is traumatic or just not something you're enjoying. So you try to avoid, get out. And so I think one of the things I very much strongly talk with people about is the idea of, how do I engage my world instead of avoiding it? And so if the tagline I use often is, if pornography is selfish, my selfish desires, my escapism, how can I be selfless and still go engage with my family, my friends, my coworkers, so I'm not so indulgent of myself? And I think it's good grounding for any addiction work. But Stephanie.
Yeah.
I would say too, when you think of addiction, we often think of the physical component that goes with some addiction, like alcoholism, where you've got some withdrawal symptoms and all of that to manage, and there may be a detox situation, and we certainly aren't equipped as a practice to do that. And so I would echo what Paul said about referrals, but the goal is to create a lifestyle that is healthy, and that means support systems from a lot of different places, and sometimes that includes us. I do a lot of family work with families that have an addict in the family, and trying to figure out how to heal those relationships or manage boundaries around that. Sometimes it's people who are have an adult addict that's their child, an adult child, or maybe a spouse or a sibling. And we talk a lot about that. And there's a good book called Addictive Thinking that I often refer people to that talks about the destructive thought patterns that go with addiction, entitlement and your rationalization. Rationalization, they would say, is giving good reasons for behaviors, not true reasons. I often say that when you're addicted to something, you kind of drink your own snake oil. Like what you're telling other people, you kind of believe yourself. It's a form of denial and process where all roads lead to the destructive behavior. And that takes a lot of work to get out of that. It's not just quitting the behavior, but it's dealing with all of those tentacles that want to pull you back toward that behavior. It's a lot of dealing with emotion and thought patterns. And so I really like that particular book for dealing with that. And a lot of times I will have people use that as a companion to our therapy in dealing.
It's so good. And there's so much there just in the, Paul, what you said, the HALT acronym: hurt, angry, lonely, tired. Did I get that right? So, I mean, thinking in terms of what we're experiencing in the midst of this pandemic and, you know, how many restrictions, how much isolation is happening out there, how many losses people are suffering, and, you know, the fatigue, the weariness that develops in the midst of all this change, all this like emotionally heavy things that are happening right now. And so to think, if we're susceptible to addiction and addictive behaviors and addictive thinking, like Stephanie said, when we're hurt, angry, lonely, tired, how much more susceptible we all are. And not just in things we might think of in terms of, like you said, alcohol or drugs, but pornography, anything, eating, could be a unhealthy relationship. There could be so many different things that we can kind of fall into that addictive thinking to kind of try to cope and escape.
Can I add this too? I think when people are trying to break those addictions, there's this mindset of zero is the goal, right? Zero drinks, zero porn, zero whatever. And if you're being honest with yourself, if it was, you know, for example, if you're looking at porn 10 times a week, now go to zero, and you've been doing that for the last 10 years, that's a monumental jump. And I am convinced that the concept of guilt and shame, they don't help you. They keep you stuck. And I think there's a very spiritual component to that. But I think spiritual battle of conviction, if the Holy Spirit's convicting you to change, that'll motivate you. So what I'm saying is, if we want to celebrate successes, well, if it was 10 times a week and this next week it's only 5, that's not great, but it's not nothing. It is success. It is moving. So one of the things I talked to a lot of people about, it sounds kind of different, but the idea of delayed gratification. So let's say after work, I want to go get that vodka and drink up a bit. Well, instead of going by the grocery store, if you wait 10 minutes, you know, instead you read, you pray, you talk to a friend, all those accountability, good concepts, and then you still have that desire. If you gave in, at least you delayed it for 10 minutes. And notice that's even a small increment of taking back control, which is the key. So maybe this week it's 10, next week it'll be 20 minutes. Next, instead of being 5 times, I mean 2 times. That is progress. And I think we need to celebrate progress instead of condemn, not perfection.
Yeah, and I think, you know, you're looking at relapse too versus just staying in the addiction. Sometimes people, if they fail to not be zero, they want to throw the towel in. Like that addictive thinking comes in that says, see, you can't do it, so don't try. And the goal is to keep getting back up. The more you get back up and keep trying, the more you create some resiliency inside yourself and increase your delayed gratification. So yeah, we talk a lot about that and how not to use guilt and shame when you are struggling. The goal is to learn from it. What are you learning from your relationship with that destructive substance when you fall short? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about God's grace. Let's talk about how do we prepare for the next time so that you're not going to be as susceptible.
I know so many people that are struggling with anxiety right now and all the what ifs and the just so many things that you could be fearful of or be anxious about in this season. So what kind of encouragement can you guys share with someone who's dealing with anxiety right now?
First of all, we need to have a lot of grace for ourselves. We know scripture, you know, talks about that we don't have to be anxious, you know, don't be anxious. But at the same time, I think what they're saying is don't it's what it's saying is don't live out in that. Don't let that be a constant place. Continue to seek God's support and support in the general for that feeling. Sometimes we get lost in it and it takes over. It's like this physiological event that happens at times, especially if you're talking about panic, but even anxiety, just very strong anxiety. Sometimes people wake up with it. Sometimes it hits because of some benign trigger that doesn't make sense to us. Sometimes we're in a pandemic and everything seems triggering for anxiety. And so it is a system in our body that's actually created to protect. It's part of that amygdala fight or flight. Anger is fight. And a lot of times anxiety feels like fight or flight. So we're sometimes freeze. And, imagine there may be nothing going on in particular that day that creates a panic attack, and you have one anyway. When I get people in and there isn't something this massive going on, a lot of times what we talk about is, let's look at all the physical possibilities that could be contributing to your anxiety. If there's nothing specific glaring, sometimes it is, hormonal or other physical things at play. I tell people a lot to get a physical and make sure, you've got a good baseline there. And then we can start thinking about, creating some sense of understanding around it. If it's triggered from like trauma or, what's going on circumstantially in your life, that kind of thing, that's a different matter. Then we want to give some ability to manage the system going on physically first. And then we move to thinking, like the overthinking part of anxiety that comes in. It's really hard to talk to yourself rationally when you're in the middle of shortness of breath, heart rate running, all those things. You have to tend to your physical self and that physiological event first. Then you can move into a more detailed approach where you might journal or do some other things. Sometimes prayer and breathing exercises can be really effective for managing the initial anxiety attack if you're having one.
Mm-hmm. Can we drill down on that a little bit? I know you just shared prayer and breathing exercises. Are there other things, techniques, things that you would suggest when somebody feels that onset of anxiety or panic?
One of the things that I often talk with people about is how our system is set up. Sometimes we hear about a lot of people that use inappropriate ways to cope, like kids sometimes smacking their head against a wall, or teens or adults cutting or doing other things to physically harm. The reason that works is because our brain will always go to the pain first, a pain response, because we're self-preserving or preserving. So instead of doing that, instead of hurting ourselves to try to manage the anxiety, a better way would be something like, sucking on a lemon slice because it's sour, and the brain will register that, and that can bring us down just enough to start some breathing exercises, right? Or I've had people get those hot, they're like gobstoppers that are really, really hot cinnamon, and pop those in their mouth for 10 seconds and then take them out and start breathing exercises. Doing some things that are safe for us. The yeses, again, having your list of yeses for coping can be really helpful, because you can't necessarily reason out of the anxiety until you deal with the panic.
That's good.
And Stephanie, I've heard, like you're saying, if someone's disconnecting or disassociating from the environment at the moment, is it to like take the deep breaths? I've heard like, tell me 5 things you see, tell me 4 things you hear, tell me 3 things you smell. And all that's to ground them in the moment, right? So you can't even do like, well, let's stop and think. I can't stop and think yet. My amygdala is taking over, like all this kind of biochem going on first. So once that's done, I like the other example I encourage people to do is, I've heard it said like a scaling question or a temperature gauge, so you're feeling like this is a panic attack. What would you call it? Well, I didn't want to go to school today, or my boss has to have a call meeting. That feels like a 10. Well, you have to go home and talk to your wife. That feels like a 5, or that feels, what I mean? So you get a scaling question to try to help them realize they can't live at the 10. Right. The temperature idea, I've heard it say, like, if you're most comfortable at 70 degrees, that's your comfort zone. Well, what makes you hot getting up to the 90s? What makes you feel like you're freezing down the side of that fight or flight or freeze could be a way to help them, again, take control of their own body regulation and realizing what does it feel like. And sometimes adding the idea of what could be worse or what could be better might change the thinking versus feeling so stuck.
And having some of those things written down for themselves that they can pull out, like, what do you smell? What do you see? What do you hear? So that they can immediately have a trigger from therapy that kind of helps them start that process, can be really helpful. And I've had clients actually use the scaling stuff that Paul's talking about, but put it on a calendar. Like, what numbers have I been today? Maybe I woke up and I felt like an 8, but by the midday I was at 5, and it can help them kind of track and see what's triggering them if they're not sure.
That's really good, Stephanie. A lot of times I do that more with anger or pornography to track patterns to see if there's like, okay, does it happen more on the weekends or in the day or work day or something like that? So you see the patterns, and kind of I encourage investigate, be an investigator of yourself or looking for those patterns. The other thing I was going to add, you talk about a tip. So classic, I talk to guys a lot who don't want to journal, right? I don't want to journal, but if I need to investigate or I want to track down my thoughts, that sounds more, I don't know, productive, not as feeling based. But so I would call it this way, the truth model. The truth is like T, like acronym. T stands for what's my trigger. R is kind of funny, but wrong thinking. What's my wrong thinking about it? U would be my unhealthy response. T would then be what is the truth of the situation? And then what is my healthy response going to be? So I'd encourage people to write those down. Maybe if they're feeling like they're an 8, to track down what was the trigger, what was the unhealthy response, and what could they change it to, and to be an investigator. So instead of just journaling.
That's good. Stephanie, if they were going to journal, what else, like what are the things that they would journal about? How can I use journaling or, task tracking, whichever word makes you feel better about it? What other things can we track?
Sometimes women prefer a little more loosey-goosey, right? Like a full experiential of an event, because it helps them see things differently, name things they wouldn't necessarily have named. So sometimes I say, think about the Kodak moment, like think about the experience specifically you want to write about. Don't worry about writing in order of your day, or you don't have to track everything necessarily in order when you're journaling. That journaling is really about you and unpacking the event or experience that you want to unpack. And I always tell people, get a crappy, notebook with wire rims, something cheap from the dollar store. You can get a nice journal, and those can be really helpful for travel or keeping things in you want to keep. But our internal editor can take over when we've got a nice journal. If we want to write up the side, if we want to write in colored markers, if we want to rip it out, you're much more likely to give yourself leeway to do those things, misspell words, cuss, whatever you need to get it out initially, and then we can process it in therapy. And if you want to, light it on fire later in your backyard, it's fine. You won't feel as bad about destroying a notebook as you will a really nice journal.
Yeah, it's good. It kind of reminds me of like the raw nature. Sometimes we don't get as much into just like the raw nature of following Jesus and being really honest and authentic and raw with God. I've at times been like when I read Psalms and how David just like laid it all out, and he just like at times is like, oh my gosh, he's going after God right now. I don't know that I could ever pray like that. And I tell other people to pray like that, but then I'm like, I don't know that I could. I don't know. It's like almost like I'm fooling God in a sense, but I love that you take it there. I mean, man, if you need to cuss, if you need to let it out, if you need to just rip that thing up, do it, but get it out. And that's another thing that I've heard in talking about anxiety is get that out of your head and express it, because it, even thoughts that when we were to say them out loud seem crazy in our heads, when it's just us inside our own heads, it makes so much sense.
Right. And sometimes really, really being honest with God in your journal can be very, very helpful. We're not throwing him any surprise parties. He knows how we feel better than we know how we feel. And so let's be completely honest with him. And sometimes bringing that to therapy and processing it out loud, it takes away a lot of the shame. Because we can let you know that, hey, that's very human of you to feel that way. Let us support you in expressing that. And then how do we want to deal with it from here?
Yeah.
When I think that rawness also it validates the importance of just sharing the ugly, the unhealthy side too, to admit that there's a part of me. I don't want to admit that, but how can I ever confront it and work through it if I don't admit it? Right. So it's
Mm.
important to write that part down too.
Yeah, we can't
Yeah.
fix what we don't acknowledge.
Yeah. And there's something like sick and twisted in the like the hiding of it, that like when you finally get to the point of desperation or whatever it is where you admit that to God or admit that to somebody else, and the response is, hey, me too, or yeah, that's normal, that's natural, that's human. There's something so healing in that, and that's where I think especially being able to talk to you guys could be so healing for people to be able to just get that, just get it out, and then to have that grace filled response that you guys are talking about. So I'm noticing like some of the things that we've been talking about are like, hey, when you get in that moment, when you feel the panic setting in, you feel that anxiety setting in, here's what you do. Are there proactive things that you tell people like, hey, before you ever have the panic attack, before you ever feel that onset of anxiety, here's some things that you can do to proactively fight against that or cultivate health, or I mean, cultivate gratitude? How do you advise people in that area?
I mean, one thing I would say is to anybody that's struggling with panic attacks, obviously getting an evaluation to see if there's a medication interventions that could be helpful is a good thing. Some people need that and prefer to go that route. I think it's such a personal decision though. Also just doing a cardio for 20 minutes, 3 to 4 times a week can help siphon some of that off. Obviously looking at who are you surrounding yourself with. Do you have a lot of people that are draining you for various reasons, maybe because of work or situations, or do you have some toxic people in your life that you need to set some boundaries with? I do a ton of boundaries work with people around how to have loving but firm responses in situations where they feel like they're drowning because of other people. And so, we would look at that too, relationally. What's your support system like? And do you have what you need in place to manage the anxiety that you're feeling?
I think Stephanie nailed it, but I would add one of the things I feel like we're getting done with counseling when we talk about relapse prevention. If you made this progress, how do you know you're not going to backslide into it? And you're saying all those things Stephanie said, but even being self-aware enough, if I am, what am I going to do about it? To remind myself to go back to the gym or to go back to journaling, to do my breathing exercises, to have that honest conversation with God and someone else to be healing. Yeah.
Yeah. Because that's part of this whole journey of life, is like, you're not going to be there forever. Everything is a season. So in the positive and the negative, if you find yourself in a really deep, dark season, it's not going to be like that forever. But also if you find yourself getting back to health, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to naturally stay there forever. So how do you recognize when you're slipping? It's good. Oh, I had a great question. Tell me a little bit about, the inputs people have. Because I think sometimes, Stephanie, you were talking about boundaries with people, but also I think we've got to, in this day and age when we're sometimes isolated, there's so many, through our phones, through our TVs, through Netflix, whatever, there's so many inputs that can be like in our lives. What can you tell me about like the inputs that people are bringing in mentally? How do they recognize when those things are, man, this is becoming too negative, I need to turn off Netflix or the news or social media or whatever it is? And yeah, what advice can you give there?
One of the things that Aaron said a while back, I don't remember the sermon series, but he said everything is a sermon. And I thought that's so true. Like, what are we filling our heads with? What's influencing our the things? We have programs going off in the back of our brain all the time while we're doing other stuff. What's processing back there? What are we taking in? Is it junk food, or is it quality material? So we need to look at, if we're struggling with anxiety too, I think you make a valid point. What are we taking in? Are we looking at everybody's vacation photos on social media? I mean, are we looking at the news and, are we watching things that fill us with anxiety? We want to be informed, but we also need to think about just the community around us. How can we can't control everything, but what can we influence? Where can we lend support? Where do we have a sense of purpose and meaning right now in the community we're in? Those things can help broaden our perspective and shake us loose of some of that anxiety. If we feel some sense of purpose and connection with other people.
And I think to kind of piggyback on the inputs, something I've noticed in myself is like sometimes just that information overload. Like it may not even be bad. Like sometimes I'll just be listening to podcasts or like listening to the Bible and I'm just like, like I can just feel my brain go, okay, I gotta stop. Like I gotta have some time to pause and decompress and breathe a little bit. And so I don't know, that to me, that stands out too, as we talk about inputs. I think we underestimate the value at times of just silence or like letting ourselves have space to breathe and, God forbid, be bored a little bit.
Yeah, be still and know I am God. Like that scripture just speaks to me a lot as somebody who's a 6 on the Enneagram. And so my brain's always on. Sometimes I need to be still.
Yeah. This has been great so far. I would like to transition into just kind of our final topic, which is depression, sometimes linked to anxiety, not always. But what kind of thoughts or insights do you guys have about depression?
I mean, I would say that it feels like a trudging through mud kind of thing a lot, like doing life, but there's this extra layer, all right? It can feel a little bit like we're separated from the things we'd like to feel connected to. And sometimes we can give ourselves a really hard time that we're not doing enough to change it fast enough. And I think we have to be patient and really look at our support system and our prayer life and know that this is a process and it's weighty. And sometimes there are chemical things at play that influence depression and make it harder to break.
Well, and I was going to say with depression, one of the first things that a lot of people bring up is the idea, should I use medication or not? And I think, like you said earlier, Stephanie, I think that is definitely a personal decision. But I always challenge people with this concept that the placebo effect is true. That if you take this medicine and you think it's going to help, it will. If you think this medicine is showing a sign of your weakness of faith or something like that, it won't be as effective. So the attitude you present yourself to it is more effective than even the medicine it is. The other thing I always add people, if you want to go down that route, I get it. But also the idea should be that short-term in nature instead of a lifestyle. And then besides medication, what are you doing for eating, sleeping, exercise, and spiritual growth if you're a Christian, right? So it's like if I stay up till 3 a.m. plugged into something and then think I'm tired the next day and grumpy, well, it's my depression. Is there something I could be doing about that with my pattern of sleep? And then the exercise and eating, junk food in, junk food out idea, try to eat healthier. And those can definitely have an impact on levels of depression.
It's good. Yeah. And kind of getting down to that root cause as much as just like, okay, here's a quick fix. Yeah, it's good.
Right. And I would say some people do need long-term medication, but again, that's a super personal decision that you make with your physician as to what you need, because, some people need medication for high blood pressure or other things forever. And that doesn't mean that they're not doing a good job. But I think Paul makes a valid point that you need to be looking at it in a holistic way, not just thinking meds are going to solve it. So yeah. we want to do what we can. And I think being patient with people who are in a depression is really important as the body to not think, well, just stop it. Like, it's not that easy. It's not like that Saturday Night Live skit. I think it was Bob Newhart where he would just say, well, just stop it. Like, it's not that easy. It's really not. There's so many factors involved, and we need to be patient and supportive with people who are struggling.
Yeah. Well, in a general concept of counseling, I think it is. I feel like it's an honor if people are willing to come and get help or talk about things in the first place. And so to empathize, to hear them, to validate them, then I hope I challenge to empower and equip them to make changes and then encourage them that they're making progress and it can be better. And each time it's a new opportunity. So keep very much to do that.
Yeah. What I'm hearing a little bit of like a synthesizing of all the things is, it's complicated, right? Depression is complicated. You want to be aggressive in the way you deal with it, in being holistic and how you approach it, you know, taking the basic steps, the basic necessities of physical, mental, emotional health, but also being patient while you're aggressive and trying to treat it. And that's hard, and it's complicated because you're dealing with some heavy emotions, and it takes time, and it's a process, and it took time for you to get here. It's going to take time to get out. So it's complex.
Yeah, and I think what the point Paul made earlier when he was talking about addiction very much applies to depression too. If you are completely frozen in it and we start working together and you get up and you shower and get dressed and do things around your house, we've got to win. Like, we have to look at those little wins and see them for what they are. Like, are you being more productive today than you were yesterday? Oh, maybe today you didn't do as well, but tomorrow you do better. Like, take it a day at a time for a while, and let's track the progression and be excited for the wins that you find along the way as well.
Which I think in itself is a discipline, right? Like, I've quoted this a lot in the past, but the phrase, what you look for is what you see. Mm-hmm. And especially when you're caught in a negative cycle of anxiety or depression or any of the things we've talked about, fear, anger, addiction, you're caught in this negative cycle. And so you're going to be prone to see the negative, and that retraining, that discipline of help me see the positive, help me see the improvement, help me see that, systematic growth, and not just see where I'm failing, which is probably part of how we got into where we are in the first place.
Exactly. It's like taking your glasses off and putting another pair on, and being willing to, look at life through gratitude and, where do I see the things that are going well, having some hope. It's not about positive thinking. It's about trying to find hope.
That's good. Well, this has been so good. I'm so thankful you guys took the time to spend with us, and I think this can really help people. If they're connecting with what we're sharing right now and they want to take a step to get help, tell me a little bit about just how they can get help, what that process looks like with you guys.
Well, obviously Traders Point has a great link to a lot of different therapists in town, depending on where you are. If you want to connect with us, we are on that, but you can also go to refininggracecounseling.com, and we have an info email and a phone line that you can call, so you can get started if you want to just find out more about us and get support.
It's also good to be in groups. Isolation is killer, and back to this idea of, I think, shame and guilt, keep us stuck, versus conviction and movements and progress. And being in group and vulnerability makes more vulnerability. In our men's group, we start sharing it. You just get closer to each other, and you realize the Me Too idea of that we're in this together. It's so helpful. So reach out. Yeah,
that's great. Well, again, thank you guys so much, Stephanie and Paul, for sharing your insights and your wisdom. I love how the conversation's gone today and just what we're going to be able to share with people. If you're watching this, and again, if you're looking for help, you can find a lot of our resources at tpcc.org/care. That's where a lot of our resources are going to be linked. And specifically, if you're looking for counseling, you can go to tpcc.org/counseling. There's a list there of all of our vetted counselors. All of them right now during COVID are offering an online option. And specifically, if you'd like to be in the same organization as Stephanie and Paul, it's Refining Grace Counseling. They're on that list. So I hope this is helpful, and looking forward to seeing you guys around soon.